Hi everyone, sorry I can't be with you today, but I don't want you to waste the time, so I've done this recording going through today's PowerPoint. So what we're going to be learning about next in relation to non-current assets is what, for accounting purposes, takes an asset from this to this. So in other words, something with a lot of value to something with clearly not very much value at all. And that thing for accounting purposes is depreciation. Or you may also have heard the word, and I haven't mentioned it, amortization. So what happens is the worth or value of lots of non-current assets goes down as they get older. They're no longer worth as much. And the decrease that we have to put through our financial records to make sure it's current. In physical assets, it's called depreciation, and for intangible assets or natural resources, it's called amortization. Now, it's important to realize that this is a non-cash expense. It doesn't actually have a cash impact in any way. It's a book entry only. So it does affect our overall profit, but it doesn't affect our cash. The purpose of it is to recognize the expense to the business of the value of that asset going down. So as we use it, it's no longer worth as much. If we think about a car, maybe a brand new car that we buy, and then we start driving it around, and maybe we drive it, 500 kilometers in a week, and we did that for a year, the car is no longer going to be worth as much as it was when you first bought it. You couldn't sell it for that. So that's what depreciation is all about. So something to realize is depreciation is a periodic charge. So this means that we only apply or process depreciation periodically, usually once a year. So a certain amount is allocated every year, and there's a couple of different ways you work out how much that amount is, and it's over what is called the asset's useful life. Now, useful life doesn't necessarily mean the how long the asset will physically last. It will mean how long it's useful to the business. So there may come a point where if a machine's 10 years old, it's now costing more to maintain, or it's out of date, so it's not useful to the business anymore, but it might be useful to another business. But for our first business, useful life is done. So that's what useful life means. Okay, so there's some important things we need to identify to work out depreciation. We need to know the cost price, how much we paid for it in the first place. We need to know that useful life. How long will we use it for? And remember, it's not always the same as how long it will physically last. And then we need to know something called residual value. And that's what we estimate, and remember it's an estimate here, as is useful life, how much money we could get for it at the end. So even though maybe it's no longer useful to us, maybe we could sell the asset for a certain amount of money and someone else could use it. So they're the three key things we need: cost price, useful life, residual value. Okay, now there's two methods we're going to look at to understand how to calculate depreciation charges. So the first one's called straight line depreciation. So this is how we work out straight line depreciation. So the depreciation for every accounting period, and remember that's usually a year, is calculated by finding the original cost minus the estimated residual value divided by the estimated life, the estimated useful life. The great thing with straight line depreciation is it's the same amount of depreciation for every period. And that's if the period is the same each time. So obviously, if we're only depreciating for half a year, because maybe we bought it halfway through the year, then that's going to need to be adjusted. But if it's for a full year or a full accounting period, it's going to be the same amount every year. And we never include GST as part of our cost amounts, original cost or estimated residual value, because remember, that's not actually an asset or a cost to the business. That's just money we're collecting for the government. So those amounts are GST exclusive. Okay, so here's an example. So I bought machinery for $132,000. So that includes GST. The machinery has a 10-year useful life. The estimated residual value is $20,000. Let's calculate the annual depreciation amount. So we're going to use that formula we just did, but before we do that, we need to remove the GST. So that 132,000, we can divide it by 1.1, and that's going to give us the amount excluding GST. Or of course you could have divided 132,000 by 11, which would give us 12,000, and we could deduct that off the original amount as well. So do whichever way suits you. So let's now put this information we've got into that formula we had. So the annual depreciation here is cost price minus residual value divided by useful life. So we've got the 120,000, which is our cost price excluding GST, minus the 20,000 estimated residual value over 10 years. So that means our straight line depreciation for this machine is going to be $10,000 per year. And it's going to be the same every year, every full year that we have it. Okay, so it's called straight line because what it does is it creates a straight line graph. So we can see here the blue bars are the asset value. So you can see it's going down by the same amount every year. And the red amounts across the bottom are the depreciation expense. And that is also creating a straight line if you look at the top of it. And it's going across by the same amount every year. So that's literally why it's called straight line. Okay, so the journal to actually account for that is done this way. So we're going to use a new account you've probably not used before, debit depreciation expense. Now this is an expense account because we have to put this in as a cost to the business. While it is not an actual cash cost, it's still a cost to the business because the value of the machine that we have is no longer worth as much. So we need to account for that somewhere, and that's what we're doing here. So debit depreciation expense, 10,000. So you can see that's the amount of the straight line depreciation. And we credit what's called accumulated depreciation on machinery for 10,000. Now there's a couple of important things to think about here. So you can see I've written in the bottom that's a negative asset account. So what we're doing with that is reducing the amount of the asset value. But because depreciation is only an estimate, because we're working with estimated values, we never put it straight into the actual asset. We're not going to know for sure how much that asset's gone down until we actually sell it, but we still need to account for the reduction in value. So we put it into what's called accumulated depreciation on machinery. And that sits as a negative asset account directly under the actual asset in the balance sheet. So as I said, this increases our expenses, it decreases our overall assets, and you would do that same journal every year until the useful life is over. Okay, so it's good. Straight line depreciation is a good way to do it because it's easy to use. You can see we only have to calculate it once really, and then just put the journal through. It's often more appropriate where the assets benefits are approximately the same over its useful life. So that means we're getting the same amount of value out of the asset every year. And the asset value is not going down in very large chunks at the early life, which sometimes happens. So that's why it's sometimes a good way to use. However, sometimes it's not the best way to do it because it does not take into account how much of the asset is used, how old it is, or how efficient it is. So it's assuming, straight line depreciation is assuming that the asset is being used up or is still as useful in year 10 as it is in year 1, and it's not going down by more than that, which is not always the case. And it doesn't take into account the likely cost of extra repairs as it gets older, because we know with older machinery, older cars, all of that type of thing, we often need to spend more money on repairs and things like that. So straight line depreciation does not take that into account. So sometimes not the best way. Okay, so at this point, you should stop this and you should have a go at this question 9.7. Make sure you check your solution. Any questions, you can see me in class. All right, I just want to go through the next one as well. So the next type of depreciation that we're going to work with is something called diminishing balance. And what happens with that is we have more depreciation at the earlier part of the depreciation time period and less later on. And there's a few things we need to know about this. So depreciation for the period is the rate of depreciation, and it's usually a percentage times the diminished balance. So there's a couple of new terms there. Diminished balance is whatever it cost us for the item in the first place minus accumulated depreciation that we've done so far. The difference with this type of depreciation compared to straight line is we've got a different amount of depreciation for every period. And also the other thing is the residual value does not really come into play here in our calculations. So let's have a look at an example for this as well. Now, before we do that though, the journal is exactly the same as it was before. So you don't have to learn two different ways to journal it. We're still going to debit depreciation expense. We're still going to credit accumulated depreciation on machinery, but the amount is going to change this time. Okay. So let's look at an example. So I bought a motor vehicle on 1st of July 2010 that had an original cost of $33,000, including GST, estimated residual value of $12,000, using a diminishing balance, or sometimes you'll see it written as reducing balance method of 20%, determine the depreciation journal for the year end 30th of June 2012. So you can see that the year we're doing it for is 2 years after we've bought it. So the best way, and that's commonly what you're going to be asked to do, and remember, it changes every year depending on what's happened before. So the best way to set this out is what's called a depreciation table, which is what we're looking at here. So let's go through the numbers that are in this. So I've got up the top there. Remember to remove the GST first. So again, we don't want GST in our value, so we need to get rid of that $3,000 GST in there. And let's read across our depreciation table now. So we've got the year, 2010-2011 financial year. The opening asset balance for the first one is what it cost us excluding GST. So that $33,000 minus the $3,000 gives us our opening asset balance of $30,000. Our rate of depreciation is 20%. So we work out 20% of $30,000, and that's going to be our amount of depreciation for that first year, $6,000. And our closing asset balance, also called diminished balance or reduced balance, is going to be the cost minus the $6,000. $24,000 is what we've got left there. Now, you can see it carries on in the same way, but something that's super important to realize is the $24,000 as our closing asset balance becomes our opening asset balance on the next line. So you can see for 2011-2012, our opening asset balance is the same as what it closed the year before, $24,000. Now we work out 20% on the $24,000, which is $4,800. So you can see it's going down, diminishing balance depreciation. And that's what we deduct to get our new closing balance. So the journal that would work here is debit depreciation expense, $4,800. Credit motor vehicle assets accumulated depreciation, $4,800. GST still not included. Okay, here's another example. Peter's purchased a new mining truck on 1st of July 2010 for $10,000 excluding GST, so we don't need to do anything about that. The estimated life of the truck is 4 years with a residual value of $2,000. Calculate the amount of depreciation to be written off each year until the truck is disposed of. And that's using straight line depreciation, so residual value is going to come into play. And calculate the depreciation journal using diminishing balance and see the difference. So I want you to have a go at that yourself. And the solution is at the end of the lesson, so you can do that as well. Diminishing balance is a good option often because when a lot of the asset's usefulness is used up in the early part of its life, like technology or motor vehicles, it's more appropriate. Also, the depreciation is less as the asset becomes older when we have to pay more for maintenance. So that's a good thing because that would be better for the business in a lot of cases. Sometimes it's not so good because it doesn't always work out nicely at the end and it's not going to match our residual balance or our estimated residual value. So sometimes we need to make a final adjustment in that last year. But there's definitely cases for why you would use that instead of straight line depreciation. Okay, so once you've done all of that, 9.9 and 9.10 is what you need to do. Make sure you check your solutions and have a go at that one in the PowerPoint as well. Okay, thanks.